I've spent 63 years learning that a mother's instincts don't lie. They whisper at first, a quiet unease you try to brush off as worry, as overprotectiveness, as that thing your son-in-law calls mom being mom. But by the time my daughter's husband called me on that gray Thursday morning in October, the whisper had become a roar. "She's fine," he said, before I'd even said hello. "Just wanted to let you know Annette won't be at Sunday dinner. We have plans." I stood at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold in my hand. My daughter hadn't called me herself. That was the first thing. Annette had called me every Sunday morning for 34 years, since she was 3 years old, and figured out how to dial the landline to ask what I was making for breakfast. She didn't miss those calls. Not when she had the flu. Not when she was in labor with my granddaughter. "What kind of plans?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "A little getaway. We need couple time, you know how it is." A pause. "She said to tell you she loves you." She said to tell you. Not she's right here, want to talk to her. Not let me hand her the phone. I set my coffee mug down carefully so I wouldn't drop it. "Of course," I said. "You two enjoy yourselves." After I hung up, I went to the window and looked out at the maple in my front yard, the one Robert and I planted the year we moved in, 31 years ago. The leaves had turned that particular shade of orange that only lasts about a week before the wind takes them. I stood there for a long time thinking about the last time I'd actually spoken to my daughter, not to her husband, not received a forwarded message, but actually heard her voice. 8 days. It had been 8 days. I want to be honest about something. I had not always disliked my son-in-law. When Annette first brought Warren home, he was charming in the way men who know they're charming always are. Handsome, attentive, good with a joke at the dinner table. My husband liked him, which meant something, because Robert was not a man who extended that easily. They watched football together. Warren helped him replace the gutters that fall without being asked. But Robert died 4 years ago, and something shifted after that. Not immediately, not all at once. It was gradual, the way water damage works behind a wall. By the time you see it, the rot has been going on for months. The canceled dinners started. Then the explanations that came from Warren instead of Annette. Then the polite but firm redirections when I called my daughter directly. "Oh, she's in the shower. She's putting the kids to bed. She's not feeling well. I'll have her call you back." And sometimes Annette would call back, but her voice was different. Careful in a way it had never been with me before, like she was reading from notes. My granddaughter Josie was 7. She had her grandfather's ears and her mother's laugh, and she was the reason I hadn't said something sooner, because I knew if I pushed too hard, if I made Warren the enemy, I'd lose access to that little girl, and I couldn't bear the thought. My son Marcus lived 2 hours away in Columbus. He'd been telling me for a year that something wasn't right. "Mom," he'd say, "you need to trust what you're seeing." But I kept finding reasons not to act. Annette was an adult. She'd made her choices. It wasn't my place. That Thursday morning, something changed. Maybe it was the way Warren had said she said to tell you. Maybe it was 8 days without her voice. Maybe it was 63 years of instincts finally refusing to be quiet. I called Marcus. "I'm going to drive out to Annette's tomorrow," I said. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Do you want me to come?" "Not yet," I told him. "Let me go first." I made the drive the next morning, 2 hours west on I-70 with a casserole in the back seat, the chicken and wild rice dish Annette had loved since she was 12. It was a Friday. Warren would be at work. Josie would be at school. I'd get my daughter alone, and I'd look her in the eye, and I'd know. I almost turned around twice. Once at the exit for Springfield when I thought about how Annette would feel if she knew I didn't trust her husband. Once at a gas station outside Dayton when I called myself paranoid and dramatic, and every other word. Daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law trade in their worst moments. But I kept driving. I pulled up to the house at 10:15 in the morning. The curtains were drawn, which was unusual. Annette liked light. She'd always said a dark house felt like giving up. The flower boxes under the front windows were empty, dead stems still in the soil from summer. She'd always replanted them in October with mums. She'd done it every year since they bought the house. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again and called her name. When the door finally opened, I didn't recognize my daughter for one full second. That's the truth, and I'm not going to soften it. She'd lost weight she didn't have to lose. And there was something in her eyes, a flatness, a distance that I hadn't seen since the week after her father died. She was in a robe at 10 in the morning. Her hair wasn't done. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked on that one syllable. "What are you doing here?" "I brought you casserole," I said. And then I just held out my arms. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and I watched her look behind her before she stepped out and let me hold her. I felt her shake, not crying, not quite, but her whole body trembling the way it had when she was small and trying very hard not to show she was scared. We sat at her kitchen table for the next hour. The house was tidy in a way that felt performative. Everything in its place, nothing warm, no Josie's drawings on the refrigerator, no mail pile on the counter. The dish rack was empty and dried and put away, and for some reason that empty dish rack was what finally made my throat close up. She talked slowly at first, then faster, then she couldn't stop. It had been 2 years. That's how long it had been building. Warren had started with small things, criticizing how she spent money, suggesting she was too emotional to make good decisions, explaining to her why her friends weren't good for her and why her family stressed her out. He hadn't raised his hand to her. I want to be clear about that, because when I say what I'm going to say next, I don't want anyone to minimize it by comparing it to something else. What he had done was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to name. He controlled their bank accounts. Annette had no access to the checking account, only an allowance he transferred to a prepaid card each week. $200, which he said was more than enough for a woman who didn't work. She had stopped working 2 years ago at his suggestion. He'd framed it as a gift, as him wanting to take care of her. And she'd believed him because she loved him and because he was very good at framing things. Her phone was on their shared plan, and he reviewed the call logs. She knew this because he'd mentioned it once, casually, as if it were nothing. She'd stopped calling me as often after that. The last 3 months had been worse. He'd started going through her personal email. He'd told Josie's school that only he should be contacted for decisions, removing Annette from the primary contact list without telling her. He'd canceled her appointment with a therapist she'd finally gotten up the courage to make. Called the office and said there'd been a family emergency. Then told Annette the therapist had canceled. When she finished talking, she looked at me like she was waiting to be told she was exaggerating. "You're not exaggerating," I said. She put her face in her hands. I drove home that afternoon with my mind running so fast I had to keep the radio off to think. I called Marcus from the driveway before I even went inside. "It's bad," I said. "How bad?" "Financial control, isolation." He took her off the contact list at Josie's school. I heard him exhale slowly. "She has no money, Marcus. He gives her $200 a week on a prepaid card and monitors her calls." "Okay," my son said, and I could hear him switching into the focused mode he'd inherited from his father. "What do we do?" "I need to find out what our options are. Legal options. And I need to do it without Warren finding out. My neighbor Sandra's youngest daughter was a family law attorney in Cincinnati. I met her at Sandra's retirement party 2 summers ago. A sharp young woman named Beverly who'd given me her card and said, "Call me if you ever need anything," in the way people do at parties when they don't expect you to actually call. I called her Saturday morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What you're describing is a pattern of coercive control. It's recognized under Ohio law, and it's relevant in divorce proceedings, custody determinations, and in some circumstances can support a civil protection order." She paused. "Is your daughter safe physically?" "I believe so, for now." "That can change. These situations often escalate." Another pause. "Mrs. Whitfield, does your daughter want to leave?" I thought about Annette's face at that kitchen table, the tremble I'd felt when I held her, the way she'd looked behind her before stepping outside. "She's afraid," I said. "But yes, I think yes. Then the first thing we need to do is make sure she has access to resources he can't monitor or restrict. Can you help with that?" I told Beverly I could. I didn't tell her yet what I was already thinking, which was considerably more than just resources. On Sunday, I drove back to Dayton. Warren was home, and I'd known he would be. I sat at their kitchen table, and I ate the casserole I'd made, the three of us plus Josie, and I watched my son-in-law pour wine and tell a story about a colleague at work and laugh at his own jokes the way he always had. He was perfectly pleasant. He always was when I was watching. After dinner, while Warren was helping Josie with a bath, Annette walked me to my car. We had maybe 4 minutes. I talked to someone, I said quietly. A family attorney. Coercive control is documented under Ohio law. It matters. She went still. Mom, I'm not pushing you. I'm telling you what I know. I pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. That's Beverly's number. She will take your call anytime, day or night. And that. I pressed something else into her hand, something small and rectangular, is a prepaid phone. It's activated. It only has 2 numbers in it. Beverly's and mine. Put it somewhere he won't find it. Her fingers closed around both. Her eyes filled up. You don't have to decide anything tonight, I said. But I need you to know you're not alone. Whatever you decide, I'm here. She nodded and squeezed my hand and walked back inside before I could see her cry. The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of waiting. The kind where you don't know if what you've done has helped or made things worse, where you replay every word for signs of damage. Marcus called every other day. I told him to be patient. Beverly sent me information about Ohio's legal provisions for emergency custody in cases of domestic abuse, financial coercion, and I read it all, twice. On a Tuesday evening, 16 days after I'd left the prepaid phone, it rang. It was Annette. Her voice was different from any version of it I'd heard in the past 2 years. Not scared, not careful. Just exhausted in the way people get when they've made a decision they should have made a long time ago, and the relief and the grief of it are happening at the same time. He left for a conference in Chicago, she said. He won't be back until Thursday. Do you want to leave? Yes. I was in my car 11 minutes later. I called Marcus on the way and told him to drive. I called Beverly and told her tonight was the night. We arrived within 20 minutes of each other, Marcus and I, from opposite directions. Annette had already started packing, moving quickly through the house with the efficiency of someone who'd been mentally doing this for months. We took what mattered, documents first. Both kids' birth certificates, her social security card, her passport, Josie's medical records. Then Josie's things, her clothes, her stuffed rabbit, the school backpack. Then Annette's necessities. Josie woke up when we were carrying things to the cars. She was confused, and then worried, and then, when she saw me standing in her doorway, she held up her arms. We're going to Grandma's house, I told her. She thought about this for a moment. Can I bring hopscotch? That was the rabbit. Absolutely, I said. We were out of that house in 40 minutes. I won't pretend it was simple after that. It wasn't. Warren came home from Chicago early Thursday morning when Annette didn't respond to his calls, and what followed was the kind of ugly, grinding, expensive process that nobody going through it can fully describe to someone who hasn't. He hired a lawyer immediately. He froze their joint accounts, but here's what he didn't anticipate. He'd been so certain of his control, so used to being the one who managed everything, that he had overlooked a few critical things. The first was that Annette had been quietly documenting for months, not because she planned to leave, she hadn't let herself plan it, but because something in her had been collecting evidence the way you sometimes do things without fully understanding why, until later. She had photographs of the prepaid card receipts he gave her each week. She had screenshots of text messages where he told her she was too unstable to make financial decisions. She had dates, times, the therapist's office confirming that a man identifying as her husband had called to cancel her appointment. The second thing he'd overlooked was that 2 days before he'd left for Chicago, without knowing it, without having any idea, he had walked into a family law courtroom and handed Beverly Hartley everything she needed, because we'd filed for an emergency protection order on Monday morning. The financial control, the isolation, the removal from Josie's school records, The documented pattern of coercive behaviors. Beverly had laid it all out with the kind of precision that made the judge reach for her pen before Beverly had even finished her summary. The order was granted by noon. It restricted Warren's contact with Annette and Josie, and it temporarily froze their joint assets, not in Warren's favor, in neither party's favor, pending full financial disclosure. When Warren arrived back in Dayton and found the house empty and a copy of the protection order taped to the front door, he called me. I let him talk. He cycled through confusion, then disbelief, then a version of hurt that I recognized wasn't real because I'd known real hurt, and it doesn't sound like that. When he finally stopped talking, I said, "Warren, this conversation needs to happen between your attorney and Beverly Hartley. I'll text you her contact information." And I hung up. There's a particular kind of silence after you do something like that. Not peaceful exactly, but solid. Like the moment after a long illness breaks, and not because anything is fixed yet, but because the turning point is past. Josie had been sleeping in my guest room. She was adjusting the way 7-year-olds adjust to disruption, with remarkable practicality and occasional sudden grief. She asked about her father. Annette answered her honestly in the careful language Beverly had suggested, that Mommy and Daddy were having some grown-up problems and that Josie was loved by both of them and that nothing was her fault. One night, about a week after we'd left the house, Josie came downstairs while I was making tea and sat at my kitchen table with her rabbit. "Grandma," she said, "did you know we were coming to live with you?" "Not right away," I said, "but I hoped." She considered this. Was Daddy mean to Mommy? I sat down across from her and thought very carefully about the next thing I said. Daddy made some choices that hurt Mommy. That's something the grown-ups are working on fixing. She nodded slowly. Are you fixing it too? I'm trying my best, I said. She reached across the table and patted my hand in a way that made my throat close. Good, she said. You're good at fixing things. I didn't sleep much that night. The legal process unfolded over the following months with the particular grinding slowness of family court. Beverly was as good as her reputation. The financial disclosure Warren was required to provide revealed what Annette had suspected, but never been able to prove. He'd been transferring money out of their joint savings for over a year into an account she hadn't known existed, close to $30,000. The judge was not charmed by this. Warren's attorney tried to paint Annette as unstable, as a woman who'd made irrational decisions and abandoned the family home. Beverly put Josie's school on the stand to confirm that Warren had indeed removed Annette from the contact list unilaterally. She submitted the therapist's office records confirming the canceled appointment. She entered the prepaid card receipts and the text message screenshots into evidence. The custody arrangement that resulted gave Annette primary physical custody, with Warren having scheduled visitation. The financial settlement accounted for the diverted funds. Annette was awarded enough to get a fresh start, not a windfall, but enough. On the day the divorce was finalized, Marcus drove down and the three of us, Annette, Marcus, and I, went to lunch at a diner we'd been going to since the kids were small. We sat in our usual booth. Annette ordered pancakes, which she used to order every time we came here, and had stopped ordering somewhere in the last 2 years, without any of us noticing until she did it again, and we all went quiet for a moment. What? She said, looking at us. Nothing, Marcus said. I just missed the pancakes. She looked between us, and then she understood, and for a moment her face did something complicated. Then she laughed. The real one, the one I remembered. I've been asked since then, by Sandra and by a few women in my book group who heard pieces of the story, whether I was scared, whether I worried about making things worse, whether I had any idea what I was walking into that October morning when I loaded a casserole into my car and drove west on I-70. The honest answer is yes, all of those things. I was terrified that showing up would make Warren punish her in ways I couldn't see. I was afraid that pressing too hard would push her further in, not out. I second-guessed every decision I made, sometimes while I was making it. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then. There is a particular kind of fear that paralyzes you, and a particular kind of clarifies. What I felt standing in that driveway looking at those empty flower boxes was the second kind. It wasn't bravery. I want to be clear about that. It was just that the alternative, driving home and waiting and hoping the unease would pass, was something I finally understood I could not do. Annette is in her own apartment now, about 20 minutes from me. She got a part-time job at a landscape nursery, which surprised no one who knew her before Warren, because she'd always had the greenest thumb in the family, our father's daughter. Josie started second grade and made a friend immediately, a girl down the street named Abby who is, according to Josie, the funniest person in the world. They came for Sunday dinner last week. Annette brought flowers from the nursery, zinnias in orange and yellow, and put them in the center of my table. We made my chicken and wild rice together, her standing at the stove the way she used to when she was a teenager, stealing tastes from the spoon. At some point she turned and looked at me across the kitchen and said, quietly, so Josie wouldn't hear from the other room, "Mom, thank you for not giving up on me." I wanted to say something that would be equal to the weight of that. I couldn't find it, so I just said, that was never an option. Some things you don't recover from so much as you build forward from them. Carrying what happened as part of you, letting it change the shape of things without letting it become the whole story. I've watched my daughter do that over the past several months with a kind of quiet determination that I recognize, that I know comes from somewhere inside her that was always there and never left, even when she couldn't reach it herself. And on Sunday evenings when the three of us are at that table, the zinnias in the center, Josie explaining something about her week with the absolute authority of a second grader, Annette's laugh coming easy and real. I think about that maple tree in my front yard, the one Robert and I planted together. How it looked on that October morning when the leaves were that impossible orange. How you only get about a week of it before the wind takes everything. How you have to be paying attention or you miss it entirely. I was paying attention. That, in the end, was all it took. I still think about those empty flower boxes. That's the detail that comes back to me most. Not the drawn curtains, not the way Annette looked when she opened the door, but those dead stems in the soil where the mums should have been. She had planted mums in those boxes every single October since they bought that house. It was such a small thing. And it told me everything. That's what I've come to understand about the way harm works in a family. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a name or a warning. It arrives in the spaces where ordinary things used to be. A Sunday call that stops coming, a laugh that goes quiet, a flower box that stays empty. If you're paying attention, you see it. If you've been taught to mind your own business, to respect boundaries, to assume that adults are fine unless they say otherwise, you might drive right past it and never know what you missed. I almost did. That's the part I sit with. For months, I told myself that Annette was an adult, that she'd made her choices, that my job was to be available and not intrusive. All of that was reasonable. None of it was enough. The truth is that what kept me from acting sooner wasn't respect for her autonomy. It was fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of making things worse. Fear of being the difficult mother-in-law who couldn't let her daughter live her own life. I let that fear make decisions on my behalf, and in the meantime, Annette was standing in a house with a man who had taken her off her own daughter's school contact list without telling her. What finally moved me wasn't courage. I want to be clear about that. It was just that the cost of staying still became higher than the cost of being wrong. I put a casserole in the car and drove west and tried not to talk myself out of it at every exit. What I found on the other side of that drive taught me something I've tried to hold on to since. Doing the right thing rarely feels certain in the moment. It mostly feels terrifying. The clarity comes afterward, sometimes long afterward, when you can look back and see the shape of what would have happened if you'd turned the car around. I don't have the luxury of knowing that alternate version of events, but I know what I found in that kitchen, and I know what a woman looks like when she's been alone with her fear for so long that she's stopped expecting anyone to notice. Beverly Hartley is the one who knew what to do with the legal pieces. Marcus is the one who drove 2 hours in the dark without asking questions. But what Annette needed first, before any of that, was someone who showed up and didn't look away. That was the only thing I had to offer. I offered it. That turned out to be enough to get us to the next step, and the next, and the one after that. Josie asked me once if I was good at fixing things. I told her I was trying my best. That's still the most honest answer I have. You don't fix something like what happened to Annette. You don't undo 2 years of quiet erosion with a court order and a prepaid phone. What you do is stay. You show up. You make Sunday dinner and put flowers on the table and let someone rediscover that they are capable of laughing freely in their own life. Recovery isn't an event. It's every ordinary Tuesday that comes after the worst of it, accumulated slowly, until one day ordinary feels like enough again. I'm 63 years old, and I've learned that the most important thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to pretend you don't see what you see. Decency isn't about grand gestures. It's about not driving away when something feels wrong. Wisdom isn't knowing the right answer in advance. It's being willing to act on incomplete information when the cost of waiting is someone else's life. And the strength that matters, the kind that actually holds when everything is uncertain, isn't fearlessness. It's moving forward anyway, one exit at a time, with a casserole in the back seat and no guarantee of anything except that you had to try.